So this is the first Engineering Insights Live, and we're talking about Monolith versus microservices. I'm not going to do death by PowerPoint, don't worry. There's just a few slides and a few little bits that I wanted to do at the start that is a little bit easier to do when we've got a bit of structure around it. But there is, like Karen said, going to be a little bit of interactivity. We're going to do a poll and we're going to do some Q&A session as well. What can possibly go wrong? So yeah, engineering insights. If you don't know about it, BGSS, we've got engineering insights page on our website, which is championed by our CTO, and it's really just to help cut through the hype and look at the harsh reality of some of the technologies that we're using some real world experience from BGSS consultants around the world. So you notice that we've got people from different offices here with us today. And our technology delivery over a few decades now, actually. So yeah, microservices, we hear about them all the time. Are they the right thing? What are real world experiences? We're going to have a chat about it. So before I do that, I think it's probably best if the panel want to introduce themselves. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lee. So I'm Rebecca McIntosh. I'm a test lead from the BGSS London office. Been with BGSS nearly 10 years, most recently working one of our financial clients.
Daisy?
Hi, I'm Daisy. I'm a software engineer based in Leeds. I joined BGSS as part of the Graduate Academy about 4 or so years ago. And now I'm currently working as part of a DevOps team as their technical team lead.
Excellent. And last but not least, Charles.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for having me today, Lee. So I'm Charles. I'm a architect and functional tech lead out here in our New York office. I have been with BGSS for almost 11 years now, seen a lot of different approaches to putting together services in structures. And I'm currently running one of our Scala cloud teams at one of our clients out here in New York.
Excellent. So by no coincidence, we've got a good team and a good panel to put together for this. So yeah, I should probably introduce myself. Lee Crossley, a chief engineer at BGSS, and part of my role is to ensure that we deliver the right solutions for our customers. So considerations like this, part of sort of everyday decisions, I guess. Right, Charles, I know that it's super early in the US. I'm not too super early, but hopefully you've had a coffee. For anyone that might not know, and I'm hoping everyone already does, can you maybe just describe what a monolith is in a really short, snappy summary?
Yeah, absolutely. So a monolith is a large box, as aptly demonstrated by the slide here. But really what we think about when we think about a monolith is a service that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a single service that runs your entire business. You can have many monoliths within your organization, but it's a service which implements many facets of what an overarching architecture needs to do. So it'll have business logic, possibly from many different domains within your organization, your data access layers, and even up to your user interfaces. Thinking back to when JSP was all the rage, this was a common pattern, and really a deployable stack that does everything rather than something specific.
Yeah, I think that the huge box on the other slide probably describes it pretty well. But it doesn't have to be a huge box, right? It could be a small box, but the fact is, it's kind of one single unit box. So on the other foot, microservices. Do you want to just try and give that same snappy summary for those?
Yeah, and I think this is a little trickier, right? Because microservices, I think, are much more ill-defined, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, right? Microservices being a split out of monoliths. You have multiple deployments that should, in theory, do specific things rather than everything, and a mesh of services that provide separate deployments and testing units across your application.
I think that's a fairly good summary, probably better than I could have done it, so I'm pleased to put you on the spot. I don't know if anyone else has any additional sort of insight onto those definitions, or if you want to just crack straight on. Straight on, excellent. So we're going to do a poll. If it's kind of lunchtime, if anyone's having a sandwich, please put it down, because what we're going to do is ask 4 really quick questions that should just take 30 seconds or less around, hopefully someone's launching the poll, around, do you work in a technical role? In your experience, which is better? Is it a monolith or is it microservices? And yeah, I put better in quotes there. Have you actually worked on projects with monoliths? How many roughly? So is it 0? Is it 1 to 2? Is it many? Because if someone asked me that question, I would just kind of go, it's a lot. I don't really know. And then same as with microservices as well. So hopefully our moderator pressing the buttons behind the screens is seeing all of the votes come in and is going to, at an appropriate time, hit results, and then I'll get to see them hopefully, and I can tell you what they say.
Yeah, so we've got, I think 17 out of 30 people have voted. So should we just give it a few more seconds? The numbers are going up, and then I'll end the polling.
I mean, you don't have to vote.
We'll give you a few more seconds, and it's a minute, and then we can answer. So I'm going to end now. There we go. So share the results.
Hey, and I can see the results. The technology works. So, wow, okay, 82% actually work in a technical role. I guess it is quite a technical subject. That helps me kind of move away from some of the higher level stuff. Which is better? No one said monolith. Not one single person. Now that surprises me. So we did an internal poll, and we did get at least, I think it was 6% that said monolith. Quite surprised that no one did. A whopping 82% said it depends, and 14% said they don't know. So hopefully those ones that don't know, we might be able to bring some insight to today. How many projects? Yeah, everybody is many monoliths, but not as many microservices, which is a bit surprising actually, because in modern times there seems to be many more microservices projects that are kicking off. So it'd be interesting to see, if maybe on the Q&A, if they're more recent projects that people have been working on monoliths for, or they've been in the software industry for so long, working on so many legacy monoliths. I'm probably creating them, but that's why there's so many. So we might run the poll again at the end, just for question number 2, and to say, in your experience, which is better, and see if that 82% on it depends, or if anybody decides that monolith has now taken the lead. So what I'd like to do next is tell you our general perception. Unsurprisingly, internally at BGSS, it was the same as it was the poll. We did actually have some people that said monoliths were better, and in some circumstances I would agree with that, and we'll come on to it. But we also say that, yeah, microservices generally are the better option, better architectural pattern. So the key themes, and panelists do jump in on any of these as when you see fit, that we spoke about when we were doing the sort of data collection, talking to our engineers, was around responsibility. So have you got abstracted dependencies? Have you got single responsibility? Can you compose that particular application into multiple perfectly sized parts? And aspects around that. We also looked at maintainability. So obviously testing plays a part in this.
On the testing front, I think sometimes microservices, they can make things a bit more complicated in terms of all the dependencies and versioning, and is everything, though everything should be compatible with everything else, that's not always the case in real life, and that can cause some interesting challenges.
Yeah, some of our engineers said under test quality for maintainability that it makes unit testing easier, for example. But I guess when you're doing that sort of quality assurance across the piece, that's not necessarily the same thing, right?
The integration testing and the end-to-end testing can be more challenging.
Yeah, and that loose coupling as well. Supportability. interesting ones. So talking about fault isolation, is hotfixing viable? So I know, Rebecca, we've spoken before about if you've got a component or a microservice component that you're rolling out a hotfix to, what does the governance look around that like? And do you then need to test the whole thing anyway as if it was a monolith?
Yeah, you do. Yeah, I do find in some projects that I've worked on, you end up having to test everything to get through the necessary processes to deploy things. So you don't get much of an advantage from deploying a single component.
Yeah. So deployability, when you've got your automation test suites, how does that affect them, or does it not really matter when you're deploying?
I think for the automation test suite, it probably, that's an interesting one. It depends how you've set up. It depends how you've set up your automated tests. Really, whether they, yes, it does depend on how you've set your automated test framework up, really.
So one of the things that we've pushed very heavily for, where I'm working right now, is to ensure that the core stack of microservices, which are all Docker images that run on Kube, can be deployed into a developer namespace in our EKS cluster, and all of our tests can operate against a developer's personal namespace with full-ish coverage of everything that we're trying to do. And I think that one of the important things about testing microservices is that you need to empower your teams to be able to run at least their section of the stack in its entirety in how it will run in a production environment without too many hurdles, because otherwise your integrations between services won't get tested until they end up getting deployed somewhere. And that's not a great feedback loop.
No, I mean, that came up quite a bit when we did the sort of initial polling of the engineers in various offices, saying that the shorter cycle times is paramount, and shorter release times as well, and lead times. I guess the final theme was around those shorter cycle times, I guess, as well, which is the agility and the business agility. I don't know if anyone else wants to chip in on any of those points, or if we just crack straight on.
Kind of following on from what we were just sort of saying, as far as having developers able to run the suite of microservices themselves in, say, namespaces against an environment. It's one of the things that we find is quite difficult, is having the ability for developers to run enough of the stack locally to be able to test it themselves before it even gets that far, and cutting down on that cycle time even earlier on as them developing the code and running unit tests, and being able to run an amount of end-to-end tests it's quite a challenge compared to, say, a monolith where you could just hit unit tests and go, and that would be it.
I guess it depends on the monolith as well, though. I mean, some monoliths are not easy to spin up locally, and things, but and I get your point, and that was common with all the sort of feedback that we got as well. That microservices sometimes make testing and assurance much harder. Anyone else want to chip in on any of the themes, or should we crack straight on with the sentiment? Excellent. So what I thought we'd do here is we've got a few really good quotes from some of our professionals across the business. So I've not named them, obviously. So you might, if anybody's watching, might see a quote of their own pop up. We've got a couple per slide, and there's only 6 slides. And then once we've done that, we'll start to move on to some Q&A. So if you want to start sending in your Q&A questions while we're doing this, that's probably a good time. Charles, do you want to kick us off with this quote? Because I feel like this is one that you might quite like.
Yeah, sure. So it's a fairly common sentiment that microservices do not reduce complexity. They just move the complexity somewhere else. And I think that this is true to some extent. One of the things that we commonly see is that our complexity is removed from the applications themselves, the bits around the business logic, and unfortunately shoved towards a ephemeral DevOps, quote unquote, service within the business where people say, we've written a microservice, now let's deploy it, which doesn't end up working that well because there's no integration. So I think you have to be very mindful of what complexity are you removing by splitting your monolith into multiple different services, and what complexity are you adding by doing so. It's all well and good to share bits of your database library, but if that means that every single microservice that you deploy has to be configured by a quote unquote operations team, then you've just added complexity to their side of the pipeline.
Yeah. Rebecca, what about the assurance side of that? Sorry, I think you actually requested to do this one because you had lots of views on it, so I'll let you take over.
No, that's okay, Lee. Yes, I think to sort of add to what Charles was saying, it does. Microservices can add to the complexity, at least, especially if there's the testing and the deployment effort. So I mean, and it does depend. It does depend on how the microservices have been designed. If they're truly independent and you're working in an organization that will truly let you sort of deploy them independently, then it doesn't add too much complexity. But if you do find that there are when you're trying to keep track of, does the version from 2 months of one of the microservices work with this new hotfix, that certainly adds complexity that
it's that organizational maturity. Is the team the right size themselves with the right experience in operating in that way, or is it actually better to tightly couple all of your microservices and deploy them as effectively a monolith? Totally get that. The second quote on here, some authors would have you believe that governance and architecture are the enemies of agile and velocity. I think that this one, I can take this one, is probably around about changing architecture drastically. So if you need to pivot into designing something completely different, it's quite tricky. But if you design a sort of sensible, flexible architecture based on other similar projects and experiences at the start, you can adapt and change in certain ways. It's not that you're restricted, but sometimes you might need to completely re-architect. But that means that you've probably proven that your idea didn't work, which is not always a bad thing.
I think on the governance side, it all depends on how you're working within the governance framework, right? If you engage with and understand what governance you need to go through early on, you should be able to build it into your ways of working. So it doesn't have to be an enemy of your velocity at all.
Yeah. To add to that, from a DevOps sort of perspective, if you're building, running, deploying it, and maintaining the service, having that good relationship with the people, like say people managing the service from the offset, means that you can embrace that sort of approach early on, as opposed to trying to introduce it late when people don't trust it.
It's a really good point. And I mean, I know we're talking about Monolith and microservices, but communication between the teams and who's responsible for which feature, and even when it's being deployed or tested or moved into a managed service, even making sure that you've got those communication lines open and all in agreement on how things should operate is often more important than what the architecture is, or where the split of the microservices or size of the microservices are. Charles, do you want to take this one, since this is the one that I was meant to give you?
Sure, absolutely. And this is not my quote, but absolutely could be. Don't solve bad engineering with bad architecture. It sounds kind of mean a little bit, but it is very true. We see, I certainly see a lot of teams that are currently operating in a monolith or pseudo monolith kind of mode. They have a system that exists right now. It's grown over time. It's gotten a little bit unwieldy, but it does what it's supposed to do. It has a decent amount of testing around it, etc. And as developers working on a project like that, when you get frustrated, your knee-jerk reaction is, oh, well, let's just split it all up into microservices and everything will be fine, which is absolutely not the right approach to take. There are applications that more naturally tend themselves towards being somewhat monolithic. These are things that don't scale independently, don't operate independently, and what you would end up with is a lot of crosstalk between services for no real purpose. However, there are, and you know, we do a lot of this analysis. There are things that often spin out of those services that have value to the wider organization. So what I often do with teams looking to do that is work on which units of this application are independently operable, which are independently scalable, and which provide independent value to other areas of the business, a service that does some set of calculations other people may want to use, for example. And what we'll do is, within hopefully an existing microservice framework at said client, help the team to extract parts rather than just split it up and say, now it's a microservice, it's all going to work perfectly, which never ends up being the case. It's its own set of problems with a bad architectural approach.
I mean, that is a theme that's come up quite a lot recently. I know our CTO is working on something about that knee-jerk reaction from one extreme to the other, given a bad experience on a project. But fortunately, because we get that kind of holistic view of many projects, we can kind of get that understanding for when that is the right thing to do, and when we can advise on, you know, maybe microservices or something like microservices is the right thing. Of course, some systems are neither, right? Just conscious of time, should we crack straight on to the next one? I don't know if anybody wants to take this, or I can take it. So I guess this is sometimes when you're an engineer, you want to do the thing right. You want to future-proof. You want to plan for every kind of change that could come through, and design the perfect system. Or you've read an article, or you've listened to a podcast about microservices, and you've heard exactly how you should be implementing it. So then what you do is you apply that to the first projects that you come across where you think it kind of fits. And to be honest, most of them, you know, don't require the textbook microservices. I've explained to teams before that, you know, you don't need to do things in certain ways just because you read it on a blog post and it makes sense. Some things make sense, but it doesn't mean that, you know, you always have to follow through on exactly that thing. There are things that can save more time, more money, more maintenance, more support in the future. And especially as, you know, a consultancy where we're working on usually clients' time, we want to deliver value quickly. We don't want to be designing things up front. We want to be evolving and making sure that we're off on the right footing. Anyone want to have a chat about this one? So I guess what they're saying is that the monolith isn't really the bad guy in the room. You know, if you've got strict funding cycles or something that suits commercially a monolith, sometimes that is a better thing to do. I've worked on a number of projects which have been small, where you just need to deliver some kind of proof of concept. You don't necessarily go along to a hackathon and say, right then, we're about to start a hackathon. Shall we do a monolith or microservices? You go straight for the features, you deliver the value, right? And sometimes with projects, it's the same thing. You're tackling the riskiest item first. And that risky item is not normally your architectural microservices. It's usually some kind of weird bespoke feature or niche tech running on some niche platform which has never been done before. Or you want to get it into the hands of the users quickly. If you want to get it into the hands of the users quickly, you're probably not spending too much time on deciding that kind of architecture. We obviously do have a number of projects where you do that quick POC and they say, right now we want to go to production. So it is always a consideration to make sure that you have the right flexible architecture that can kind of move you forwards.
Cool. So this quote is more about how big or small should a microservice be. It's not really well defined in the name. It's just a microservice. There's loads of factors as to how big or small this is going to be. It totally depends on what it's going to be used for, how are you going to scale it, how are you going to deploy it. In my experience, we have microservices that can be super tiny because all they're doing is exposing some information from flat files. So that's an example of something that is small but suits being small. But then you'll have others that may have to contain a lot more business logic and interact between a lot of the other ones, at which point that doesn't look quite the same as a microservice. It can be a bit bigger. So the complexity is a bit of a component in that when we're talking about it. Projects, when we're talking about monoliths, they can kind of just keep getting added to. So the bigger they get, the more people don't want to look at them, the more people just start adding new classes, new functions, instead of taking that time and refactoring them. Whereas if you're talking about microservices, you can have the opposite problem where you just get everything into tiny little bits and pieces. I've heard horror stories about nano services where you've literally got one function in a service that can be deployed on its own, but at that point, the orchestration cost of that must be horrendous.
I think I might know who you're talking to about that. Possibly. I mean, there's quite a few, but so there's a sort of function as a service that we're not really we're trying to steer clear of, but yeah, it becomes, when you've broken your microservices down to that kind of granularity, you are effectively just running, Azure functions or lambdas, and trying to manage those and keep on top of those can be much, much harder. You're just moving that into DevOps or your Terraform or your ARM templates or whatever it might be, and trying to manage it in other places. Back to the quote about moving the complexity somewhere else. We actually had a question, I think. I don't want to jump straight into the Q&A around the sizing of microservices, and that is a tricky one. I don't think we have a definitive answer for that, I'm afraid. I think that that's a very, very long-winded answer that probably requires a bit more input into what your actual system is. But yeah, I'll close the Q&A down. We'll crack on with these and then we'll come back to it. Monoliths are not always bad. Can we do that one already? No? Oh, it's the last one. Who wants to take the last one?
I mean, this is an interesting monoliths being misunderstood. I think when we were just discussing earlier, even the word monolith, it has mono has some sort of negative connotations, mono versus stereo, for example. So even and if it's a bit, it sort of makes you think of it slow things and sloth. So I think just the word itself makes people think they're inflexible and can't be changed. But that's not necessarily the case. If you design a monolith well in the first place, then you should be able to re-architect and break it up later if necessary.
Yeah, and I think Martin Fowler himself, who coined the term microservice, kind of said that some of the best microservice architectures are the ones where they were originally monoliths and broken pieces off and kind of done in the right way, rather than sort of over-architecting that in the first place. So it could be that you start with monoliths in quite a few cases, and they aren't the big slow thing that you necessarily think they might be. It's the case that the monolith actually might be a really small, efficient piece of software, which you then, as it grows, rather than organically patchworking it, which was a lovely quote from somebody that had been working at a university, said that organically patchwork over 50 years, that's what we kind of take the perception of a monolith as, and it's this this big thing with all different colors and all different pieces of quilt, different tech, and all different kinds of tech debt within them that are strung together badly, and you kind of lose where the data flow is and stuff. A monolith doesn't necessarily need to be that. Yeah, that is a monolith, but it could be something that we've designed, built quickly, and is deployed to production and working and delivering in value quickly.
You've also got those benefits of if you're looking for something that is low latency and you don't want to have a lot of network calls everywhere, that if you're then deploying a monolith, you can cut those down to help out in that space a hell of a lot more than if you're having to negotiate everything, talking to each other across a network.
In fact, something that came up in, I think about 4 people from the London office said the same thing. So obviously there was a project where they'd got some influence, which was cross-cutting concerns and logging. Monoliths, they know exactly where the logs are, and it's so much easier to debug. And then, you know, you've got all these services like, where are the logs? Which logs? Which bit does that bit? And if you don't think about your logging when you're designing your microservices, in fact, it just creates obvious pain, which we've obviously been through on some project somewhere. So yeah, monoliths are not always bad, which is why I was surprised that 0 people voted for a monolith at the start. But maybe we'll change your mind. We'll see. Yeah, I guess we kind of covered those ones there. I'm not sure who this quote was because I kind of wanted to give them credit for it. But yeah, go into a microservice architecture right from day one when you don't necessarily need to is the root of all evil. So I'm going to kill this deck now because I promised not to do too much PowerPoint, and I've done half an hour PowerPoint. And we'll go through and answer some questions, hopefully. So to kick off, the first question is from someone called Alex, I won't give surname, and he says, if there are any such microservice interdependencies in an end-to-end testing, are they too granular? Maybe I'll read that one again because I kind of fluffed it. If there are any such microservice interdependencies in end-to-end testing, are they too granular? So this is coming back to our size of microservices again. Don't know if anyone wants to take that one.
So I would say I don't think so, but it actually more depends on how you define end-to-end testing than how you define your microservices. Necessarily, there will be times in which a user journey will go through multiple services. It's the nature of having microservices. Otherwise, you would have just a single service. And while interdependency may be kind of a loaded term, there are certainly going to be user stories which require you to have data come in at point X and Y, and at some point that data be percolated to a user somewhere or into a database somewhere. And how that flows internally is actually kind of irrelevant to how you set up your test journey, right? Because if you really are from one end to the other end, what's internal to your service stack is not really something you should have to worry about. What you're concerned about is, when I take action X, do I end up with result Y, whatever is internal to the stack as a whole.
So I guess it's about what size is manageable by whatever metric you define as manageable, as opposed to anything else. I don't know if anyone else has got any sort of comments on that. No, we've got a great next question actually, so I'm going to skip straight to this one. I'm not going to read it all out because it's quite long-winded, so I'm going to try and summarize it. How do we avoid dependency brittleness and managing multiple generations of services? So, I mean, this is the age-old question of how autonomous should your microservices be, and how do you do your versioning, you know, via some sort of semver, and what shared components and what do you have between them? We've actually developed a project before where we did actually tightly couple some microservices in certain groups in certain ways to avoid that surprise it went bang in production because of some weird and wonderful thing that wasn't tested for because it was using a weird and wonderful version that we didn't run the suite against or whatever it might be. And actually convincing people that you don't need to be 100% decoupled is sometimes quite a struggle because of the the bit that we go back to before about having this textbook. Oh well, yeah, but this team shouldn't have to know anything about this team. The analogy that I used was when I go for my sandwich at lunchtime, and Julie's making the sandwich. It's just Julie's shop. It's Julie's sandwiches. She takes my money. She goes in the back. She butters the bread. She sticks the stuff in. She puts it in a bag. She hands it over to me, and she knows I want crisps as well. She picks some crisps off the side, and then yeah, that's it. It's sort of a single transaction. Whereas if Julie wants to, employ someone else and try and scale that operation out, she probably wants to look at what some of those features are. And you probably want to just do it simply like you got the front end. Why not just have that transaction processing as part of the system or part of the service? And then you can start breaking up the back end in different ways as and when you need more people. What you don't want to do is have somebody that potentially knows how to butter bread and how to do the sandwich in that way. But what they might not know is when one day you suddenly get a loaf of bread that's not cut and you don't have a knife. Exactly what do you do with that? So it is about making sure that maybe everybody back of house or everybody anything to do with bread then knows about something in some context about everyone else there. Don't know if anyone else wants to kind of add to that really bad analogy, which I'm never doing again.
I think that there are like tools that you can bring in to help you manage this sort of thing though. One of the things that we use is packed testing, and we treat all of the services like they're separate APIs and to make sure that they maintain those contracts. But we do that between both our services and services managed by other teams. It's helpful to give you confidence and use tools like that so that you can trust that by updating versions of one thing, you're not going to necessarily upset another version of another.
Yeah, and I think having sensible demarcation of what is your API to other places in the organization and what is internal to yourself is pretty important as well. And the governance around each is very different, right? The services that we build that are used by people in Europe and Australia, etc., are very strictly managed, and we're very careful to not make any breaking changes and only fix forward, etc., only expand for what they see. The stuff where the aspects where our services communicate with each other here in the US are a little less aggressively governed because it's, although not right now, it's much easier to walk around the office and say, I could really do with changing this field. Is it going to break anything for you guys? It's a lot harder to do that with international teams.
So you say that, but actually, I've realised recently communication's got better since COVID, and we've just been able to jump on a Zoom with everybody, which I admit is a little annoying sometimes. You can have these conversations as if those distributed teams were in the office. Have you seen that change or?
There are people that are very good at it. There are people that are not so good at it, and time zones are a nightmare.
Yes.
Yeah. The client that I'm currently working with has operations globally, who are all part of the tech operations. So yes, it's very easy for you and I to have a conversation. We have an overlap of 4 hours, 5 hours, depending on exactly what schedule we're working. Whereas the overlap between New York and say Beijing is very, very poor, and really does lead to a gap in communication between teams internationally.
We've got let's move on to the next question. Oh, good phrase. This is actually from someone at BGSS. I won't read the name out because it's quite distinctive. What are your thoughts on the phrase distributed monolith that sometimes arises when talking about microservices? There's so many pet phrases like this that I hear bandied around all the time. There's the many mini monoliths and what's the other one? The nanoservices that we touched on a little bit. Has anyone got any thoughts on distributed monolith?
I have some thoughts on distributed monoliths. they look like microservices, they smell like microservices, but then when you come to try and deploy them, or if you come to try and update them, you've got to treat them like a monolith because they've got the buzzwords, but they're not able to actually perform why you wanted the microservices in the first place. It seems to be, from my experience, you can untangle them, you can try and work with them, but it's a state that I think you can find yourself in if you've not designed something to work a certain way from the beginning. It touches on a lot of the things that we've talked about earlier, I think, during some of those quotes.
Yeah,
cool. The most common cause of this that I've seen is when people share databases and then use a database library like Hibernate, where if you change the schema, everything stops working. Were you to make any changes in your centralized data store at this point, every service that uses it is dependent on it. And I think that as we move more into cloud architectures, etc., and using slightly less strictly relational databases, as many are wont to do these days, we avoid a lot of that, which has its own set of concerns, but yeah, it really is a driver of distributing monoliths.
Moving the complexity, should we say, somewhere else, which is often the case. And coming back to that knee-jerk reaction comment that you shouldn't just switch it because you had a bad experience doing it one particular way and back to the other extreme. Next question is a really good one, and it says, Lee, you mentioned you shouldn't use any architectural approach just because it's the latest fad. But if we assume functional requirements can be met either way, what would be the main non-functional requirements? Okay, it's quite a long one, so I'm going to take the start of it. Yeah, we shouldn't just use any latest technology because it's the latest technology. On a client's project that we're kicking off, what we would generally do is most of the BGSS engineers, especially the ones that I know, are passionate about technology, and they've probably already tried it and they've built something at home and they've already got some experiences. And we have sort of internal lunch and learns, internal sessions where we share those experiences. And then if there is, a customer that wants us to try out that new technology, we've already got that sort of backing and foresight, and we can work with them to kind of to look at it. Yeah, when you say what would be the main non-functional requirements, I guess it's also down to the customer and what their particular project is. So some projects aren't Netflix and Amazon, and they don't have their NFR requirements. Sometimes we've got systems where they are critical, and we need certain levels of serviceability, testability, availability, all the abilities. But yeah, it is about defining your NFRs appropriately and agreeing them usually in a very early stage in the project, not waiting until the sort of last sprint and going, so what's the uptime requirements? What's the what are the other things that we need to consider? I don't know, Rebecca, if you've got any comments on the sort of NFR side of things, or if I've kind of covered enough.
Yeah, no, I think you've covered most of it, and yeah, I'm not sure how much that those would influence. I think they would have an influence on the design, but almost I would say you kind of almost need to take the two several approaches and almost sort of run them and go, which one gives us the best combination of outcomes, and take all those factors into account when assessing whether it should be a monolith or microservices, and the size of those microservices, how big the team should be, and that kind of thing. And yeah.
Cool. I think we're overrunning slightly. Can I just do one more question, Karen? Because it's quite a good one. It's an anonymous attendee though, so I don't know who sent it. But it says, what's the difference between SOA and microservices, as in service-oriented architecture? So I've just opened up a question that's going to take us half an hour to answer. My one-line answer, I guess, is they're probably groupings of microservices. So when we're coming to that kind of logical distinction of business units and breaking things up into certain sizes, it's probably somewhere between a monolith and a microservice. My cop-out answer. So I guess, Karen, you want me to wrap up then? Is that what you're here for?
Well, we are coming to the end, but like I said, we will be able to continue the discussion. Obviously, we'll be following up. So if you want to just do anything as a close, and
yeah, absolutely. So Engineering Insights, this is our sort of first live one, and it is on a particular topic. We've actually got the data for another few others that are coming through. But if you've got particular questions on this one, or you want to go look at some of our other material on the Engineering Insights BGSS website, you can do that. And also, if you've got more questions or suggestions for the next one, if I'm allowed to do another one, then yeah, if you tweet us or contact us on LinkedIn, we'll see whether we can set that topic for one of the subsequent events. I think that's it from me.
Thank you, guys. It was a really good session. I particularly enjoyed the sandwich analogy, Lee, that we did get on video, so it will be shared. And as Lee said, we will be following up with the recording of the session. So if anyone joined late, you won't miss out on anything. And also there'll be a curation of all the questions that have been asked. Anyone can send an email to me if they want to ask anything else that we didn't cover today. So I will send an email after this session, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for the future Engineering Insights. So thanks again to our panel, and thanks, Charles. I know it's an early start for you in New York.
No problem at all. I've had a great time. Thanks for having me.
Great stuff, and we will see you all soon.